Put your hands up your head.
I did.
Now!
And I'll bet your mother had a loud bark.
Good morning. This is Morning Coffee with the Chief. I am your host, Patrick Jordan, and we have a fantastic show for you today. This is the film we're going to do today is the first international film that I will review with a couple of great guests. I have some excellent experts that can talk about what is going on south of the Mexican border all the way down through Brazil in policing. But before we get into our movie, I want to put a plug in for the Los Angeles Mission. As usual, Thanksgiving is coming up for the Los Angeles Mission. They provide a full meal for the folks down on Skid Row with all the trimmings, and they do not get government support because they are a faith-based organization. They have a faith base that runs through their curriculum and everything they do, so government cannot cut them checks. So they need you to help them out so they can make a special day. And basically what they do is they provide a full meal, Thanksgiving meal, the day before Thanksgiving, and they provide some services as well, some basic services. They give away, socks, shoes, underwear, you name it, and they do outreach for people who might be ready to get off the street. So they, in addition to providing a great holiday meal, they give away stuff and they do outreach for folks who are ready to get off the streets. But they are a nonprofit. So go to losangelesmission.org and make a small donation today, $25, $50, $100. And I will say that one of my guests, Danny Kuhn, has decided that he's going to do a little bit of a fundraiser to help the Los Angeles Mission. So I greatly appreciate Danny Kuhn's effort to raise money for the Los Angeles Mission. And you could do that too. You could just, how they do that Facebook thing where on your birthday people can raise money for an organization. Consider doing the Los Angeles Mission. Homelessness is the scourge of the day. And I will say we're finally a little bit on the right path. The governor of California, after spending billions of dollars on Housing First, which was a failed strategy in my mind, having been involved in homeless strategies for the last 10 years, switch to a care courts model where they can take people with mental illness off the streets and they can commit them and get them services. There needs to be some little coercion for some of these folks, and finally he's recognized that. He's stopped listening to the far left. He's been given this idea that you got to give them housing first before you do anything else, and that is a failed strategy. They just had to prove it with spending billions of dollars. But now let's get on to our regular show here, and I have two great guests on, and I guess I'll introduce them by rank. So first we'll start with Chief Ralph Ornelas. Ralph has been on my show before. Ralph was the chief of Westminster Police Department, but he also retired as a commander from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. He's originally a New Yorker, so you'll hear a little bit of that accent in his voice. He's a Latino and an Italian, so he gets the best of both worlds: Mexican food and Italian food, which is fantastic, right? And he also has an expertise in what we'll be talking about, and that is policing south of our border, all the way through to South America. Hey, Ralph, welcome, and thank you for coming on the show.
Well, Chief, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And once again, I'm looking forward to this dynamic conversation with you and also Dr. John Sullivan.
Okay, great. And, and I do appreciate having you on because you do raise the level of discussion. I mean, I have a lot of great guests on. I had the last show, I had Johnny Bayless on, and God, I forget who my other guest was, but he does a great job as well. So I have a cadre of really good guests. I count you as one of them. So our next guest is Dr. John Sullivan. He's a retired lieutenant from Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. And we are talking about a movie that is based in Brazil and Brazilian policing. And John, just a few weeks ago, came back from Brazil, where he gave a presentation to prosecutors down there on I guess reforming their criminal justice system might be the easiest way to say that, although it's probably a lot more nuanced than that for John. John, welcome to the show again, Dr. John Sullivan.
Hey, thanks, Pat. Good to be here. Look forward to our discussion. The movie we're going to discuss is a classic. And the situation they describe has still manifesting itself in ways even more complicated than we see in the film. So it'd be great to talk about all this.
So Dr. Sullivan, as usual, has written a book on this subject. I think we're going to get that to scroll underneath our show here so that you can go onto Amazon and maybe purchase that book and get a little more in-depth understanding of what is going on in Brazil. There it is. It's Competition in Order of Progress, Criminal Intelligence, Insurgencies, and Governance in Brazil. That's a mouthful there, John.
Yeah.
You want to explain just the 30-second explanation of that book?
Yeah. Just so you get the title comes from the Brazilian national motto, which is like order and progress. And it's actually, you can see it on the Brazilian flag. And the reason we call it a competition for order and progress is because in Brazil right now, some of the gangs, not all, but some of the gangs, what the top end gangs, which I would call third generation gangs, are directly confronting the state and challenging state institutions. And they're engaged in what David Kilcullen, who used to support the Coalition Provision Authority, Kilcullen is a former Australian military officer, very well versed in counterinsurgencies, what he would call a battle for competitive control. Who governs on the street? And in this case, we see that there's a high degree of criminal governance in the favelas in Brazil. It's not limited to Brazil. We see similar things in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, parts of South Africa, and hopefully not here. But the early indicators, because these are globally linked organizations, there's a global illicit political economy that comes together. So the book, my colleague and my colleague Dr. Robert Bunker and I have been doing a lot of research into criminal armed groups globally. And over the years, we did a lot of looks at what was happening in Brazil, looking at the conflict between the two main gangs, the Comando Vermelho, or the Red Command, which we'll just see in this movie, and the PCC, or the Primero Commando, First Capital Command, Primero Commando Capital, in Sao Paulo, both of which have global links. So we documented over the years a whole bunch of evolutions in the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and the criminal governance of these gangs. We collected them in the book and got together with some specialists who put some material in the front and back discussing the situation. The conclusion of the book is in English, but also we did that in Portuguese as a nod to our the area we're looking at.
So I guess we need to deal with that. For those who are challenged in geography, during the age of exploration, there was competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and that competition spread into South America. And the Pope arbitrated who got what, right? And so Brazil ended up going to Portugal, right? Which is why we have Portuguese spoken in Brazil and Spanish in the rest of South America for the most part, as I believe. But there was other actors involved there, but that's why we have a Portuguese speaking country in South America. But before we get into the movie, which is Elite Squad, I want to ask you something about this relevant that's going on today. You can both weigh in. I had you on a show called Dirty War, and I asked you a question about the focus of the United States on terrorism. I said that I felt we were focused way too much internally on domestic terrorism, and it was political, and that we were not focused on Islamic terrorism. And here we are, we're about a week away from an attack that had occurred in Israel, a brutal, vicious attack inspired by Iran and ISIS-type tactics by Hamas into Israel. And now Christopher, our FBI Director Wray, is arguing, we need to now switch gears from domestic terrorism to focus on Islamic terrorism that might occur in our country. I wanted to get your brief thoughts on that because I feel it was a failure of the administration. And where are you at on that issue?
Well, Pat, I don't know if it's a failure of the administration, because I think there's been a failure in addressing domestic and international terrorism long term on all sides of the political spectrum in the United States, and underestimating the risk of terrorism. I think, and I've published this in numerous things, we have a tendency to want to do one thing or another. Before 9/11, which to me was a seminal terrorist attack. I grew up in New York, used to work for the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey. So when the towers fell, it was a real blow. Before that, there was domestic terrorism in the United States. We spent a lot of time looking at right-wing extremism, white supremacists. And then when 9/11 came, we shifted gears. We need to deal with more than one threat at a time, because there are multiple threats occurring right now. And the terrorist attacks on Israel by Hamas are a new flavor of terrorism. They're actually operating more like a criminal armed group with some insurgent capability than just limited terrorism. And terrorism and insurgency link. We need to be able to deal with that. There are certainly links between organized crime, which we'll be talking about, and groups like Hezbollah, throughout Latin America, particularly in the tri-border region. And they're not new. They've been there since the 90s when I first wrote about them. It's 30 years later, and things are still moving. We need to deal with both. The problem is it's not just at the executive level. If you look in Congress, there's 150 or so committees or subcommittees that have a reach into these issues, so that it's incredibly complicated. We need to realize, and we don't want to do the same thing we did before, say, okay, we just got hit by jihadists, that's the threat, and forget all the other threats. We have to work at them together. And I'll tell you what, there is likely to be alliances of convenience between the groups. So jihadis will work with right-wing extremists. Right-wing extremism isn't unique to the United States. It's not new to the United States. It's the flavor of the day. In the last several years, most of the deadly attacks and the largest volume of attacks have been from the right-wing groups. That didn't mean that jihadis went away. They're going to hide when we shift our perspective. So what we need to do is, I think, open our aperture to realize that there are multiple threats. They're simultaneous and they interact. And how do these terrorist groups fund themselves? Well, they fund themselves through organized crime, right?
Yep.
Hezbollah is not just a terrorist organization. They're a criminal enterprise, and they, in fact, govern at times, which we'll see happen in this movie. So I think it's complicated. I think we need to open our eyes. I think our domestic intelligence structures are immature. There's still room for some development and working, and getting a sound capacity to assess the threats, prioritize the threats, and know we're dealing with more than one thing at a time. And that's hard for government to do, because politics chases the loudest noise. And I'm saying there's lots of noise out there, and we have to address them all.
Well, I agree that we should be focused on all of it. Ralph, I mean, this is a kind of seminal event in the world today. And do you have any thoughts on Israel and our direction on focus on terrorism previous to the attack and subsequent to the attack?
Well, previous to the attack, I believe that the United States, the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, we needed to work much better together. Okay, and I could go back to 2006. Well, FBI, LAPD, and LA County Sheriffs met, and we worked down in El Salvador. And we started a Central American law enforcement exchange program. And it was funded by the Merida Initiative, which President George W. Bush and the president at the time, Calderon, they met down in Merida, Mexico, and there was a lot of money funded for this program. Let me elaborate. This Central American law enforcement exchange program was really flourishing until a person within the LASD stepped in and did something that shouldn't have done. And the reason I say this to John and you and the audience is because we could have been way ahead mitigating some of the activity of transnational gangs, because what we did at that time for 2 or 3 years, we brought in investigators from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica. We even had some from Mexico, but also United States agencies, Fairfax, Virginia, Suffolk County, Los Angeles, Houston, LA County Sheriffs, and we started in a direction to really understand what's going on between the blood triangle. I call the blood triangle from United States all the way down to Central America, and it could go beyond that. But I know we don't have much time, and I just want to get to the point of this though. We were going down interviewing prisoners in Izalco, Zacatecaluca, Coatepeque, Centro Barrio prisons in El Salvador, and also in other prisons in Honduras and in Guatemala. We found Islamic writings on these gang members, 18th Street and MS-13's backs, stomachs, which a lot of people don't talk about, but we documented this. So the point I'm making here, John hit it head on. It's this. We should have continued what we were doing, because we could have extracted information, intel from these people, these inmates, that led us into the streets, which one of my detectives, Luis Trejo, interviewed a guy named Gallardo, who became an informant for the FBI and stuff. Well, guess what? He laid out everything, what they were doing in the plazas, coming all the way from Central America into Mexico, into the United States, and then also branching off, but also bringing in Islamic extremists. So what does that tell you? And John's an expert in this. What does that tell you? These cells have been created, and we could have mitigated this. We've been more proactive and listened to some of the people on the ground instead of some of the people who are up here someplace,
Yes.
who don't know diddly squat, who never saw it, never smelt it, and been on the ground to see it. We could have been far ahead of this. Now, talking about what's going on right now in Israel, I don't care what anybody. I was part of sent over to a special operations division when I became the captain of narcotics. I got briefed by a lot of DA. Where do they get the money? Where does the Middle East they get the money? Well, they get the money. Unfortunately, sometimes some people from our government give them the money, right? But also, they're connecting the Middle Eastern terrorists are connecting with the cartels to make money also with the drug terrorism. So, if we could have been much more methodic and also much more on target instead of worrying about politically, and I'm saying this regards to my former department, your former department, we could have truly been ahead of the game to really impact street gangs and also street and terrorism too. So anyway, that's my dissertation.
Well, no, thanks for your comments. What I'm hearing is bureaucrats and politicians get in the way of good policing at times, and I think we've all experienced that at some point in our careers. And and I just appreciate you guys staying on top of the issues, because eventually the pendulum swings. Unfortunately, people die, and people start paying attention to people like us again. Say, what should we do? And so, thank you for weighing in on that. I think it's relevant. I really want to talk about get started on the movie, and then I want to ask you a little bit about El Salvador, and then the cost of drugs in Central and South America, which we don't hear a lot. So the movie we're doing today is Elite Squad, which came out in 2007. It's a Brazilian crime drama. I watched the Portuguese version with English subtitles, so I had to go back a lot and watch it there just to maybe I catch some nuances. You don't quite get all the nuances in the when it's subtitles, but I did the best I could, and I'm really excited about doing this because we do crime dramas here, and this one we get to weigh in on some real meaty issues on what's going on south of the border. And so let me talk about those two issues, and then we'll get a little more broadly into the movie and take the suggestion of our manager and talk a little bit about the different policing in Brazil before we actually jump in the meat of the movie. But I wanted to ask, they talk about narcotics, the narcotics trade being driven primarily by North America and our consumption of narcotics. And I agree with that narrative that, if we really want to solve the problem, we need to stop the hedonistic behavior and taking all these drugs, right? But these, those people who embrace drugs as, their prime or one of their primary trades, they also deal with it. And the example I give is Obrador down in Mexico for a long time said that we don't have a fentanyl problem. Yet one of the states down there funded by an American nonprofit, I believe, they don't do drug screens on their desks. So they don't know if they really had a fentanyl problem or not. And based upon the money they gave them, this one particular state checked everybody, and they had a significant problem with overdoses due to fentanyl, which they were unaware of. They were just characterized as other things. So very much like the United States, probably not as severe as the United States, but it's there and it's growing. And I remember reading an article probably about a year ago today on methamphetamine, same issue. The methamphetamine is coming up from Mexico, or the precursors are, and they have a methamphetamine addiction problem as well as in Mexico. And I suspect that this is the same in Central and South America for both of these, because this movie is about drug dealers in the favelas in Brazil and fighting them. So when you engage in the trade of narcotics, there is splash over to your communities as well. John, your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an awful lot to get to. I'll first start with the discussion, your question about how the police are organized in Brazil. And
Okay.
that'll give us a foundation. Now I'll get into fentanyl, which is an incredibly complicated topic, and there are different nuances in different nations where it plays out. So Brazil, like many other nations in Latin America that have a kind of a civil law influence, going back to the days of Napoleon, in some ways, has divided its policing into two spheres. Preventive policing, which is a patrol on the street, which in Brazil is conducted by the military police, or the Polícia Militar, and they are state entities that can be called up and nationalized during time of crisis. But so they're military, and they do preventive patrol. For investigative police, the civil police is the organization that investigates, crime, does the detective work, what we would see in our detective divisions in our common law, U.S., British, English-speaking legacy. The two coordinate or not, depending upon individual relationships with people. We all know that. That's how police works everywhere. To compound that, Brazil is a federal state, so you have each individual state has their police, civil and military, and then there is a national organization, the Brazilian Federal Police, who handle that and work together. They interact much like we do with our FBI and others, but they're separate. Now, fentanyl, interestingly, fentanyl has been on the rise for years. I'm looking at the stats of how the epidemic is going. It's like spiked incredibly since 2014.
Yeah.
Like a colossal geometric increase. Now, fentanyl is largely looked at as a U.S. problem for consumption, and in our view, we often look at the majority of fentanyl moving into the United States through Mexico, and in part that's true. Most of it, however, 75% roughly of the fentanyl and related pills related to fentanyl come through the San Diego, the West Coast route, and then they move throughout the United States. Most of the interdictions of or seizures of fentanyl in Mexico occur in San Diego, Mexicali, Tijuana, Baja California in general, followed next by the area in Sonora, near Nogales, and so south of Arizona, and not so much on the East Coast. Although when you look at the actual fentanyl usage in the United States, the West Coast, where it's coming in, is the smallest, and the biggest problem with fentanyl in the United States is in the Northeast, followed by the Midwest. So I think what you're seeing here are global illicit networks or global illicit political economy fueling a whole range of drugs. And
speak to the splash over in the countries and in Central and South America, how it impacts their communities as well, whether it's just violence between gangs or just the deaths.
Well, it's multifaceted. All of this is multifaceted. To get fentanyl to the United States, it generally comes from China, moves precursors and finished product, a little bit of each, across the sea into Mexico, one route. From Mexico into the United States. Some of it stays in Mexico. The next route is China direct to the United States, often to California because we're on the Pacific coast, often in the kind of Bay Area, a little north of us. And then the third route is from China with precursors and finished product into Canada. And some of it stays in Canada and some of it comes to the US. The US is the biggest market for all of this. Right now, we've been finding that the use of fentanyl and mixing it with other drugs like cocaine and heroin and other, one of the ones that's truly scary is the xylazine, the trunk, which is a veterinary medicine that's not even regulated. It's not a controlled substance in the way other things are, create an echo effect, like almost like throwing a rock into a pond and watching it move out. Most of the fentanyl in the way we know it, the illicit fentanyl, is moving toward us from all those different vectors. So interestingly, the Chinese have a back channel. They like to diversify, I guess, and move some of their product into India. Now we're starting to see fentanyl and precursors from India coming into the United States. The fentanyl markets in Mexico, it's growing. It's unknown. There is political denial, as you pointed out. But a lot of the fentanyl, there was an article published yesterday at Insight Crime, which looks at Latin American organized crime. And they would argue, and I think there's more research needs to be done, that the biggest problem in Latin America isn't with the illicit product that we're moving through the chains we just talked about, but diverting pharmaceutical fentanyl and stealing that and selling that. So their markets are immature. We often call these groups drug trafficking organizations. That's really a misnomer. They're transnational criminal organizations involved in lots of different criminal enterprises.
Right.
So
So Ralph, a little bit more splash over. So if you engage in drug trafficking in your country, your communities are also going to be impacted, whether it's fentanyl in this case, which generally comes directly to Mexico or Canada, the U.S., or its evil sibling, methamphetamine. It does impact your communities, or cocaine. People get addicted and people die from these substances in those countries as well. And there seems to be a little bit of denial south of the border that they have a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you an example. When me and the team from both LAPD and LA County Sheriffs went down El Salvador, we had to do an evaluation of their crime lab. And, they're not testing the way we test. And the United States government has provided all the technology to do all the testing. And even if you talk about murders, I mean, they were basically not even 5% of the murders were being, solved. And you go in Mexico, the same thing. And what we saw was the toxicology tests weren't being conducted the way we do. Yeah. That said, though, John and Pat, right now, a neighbor of mine is a coroner for Orange County coroner here. He's the head guy. And guess what? They're all backed up. And he just told me the other day, because what I'm doing, just to let you know, John, just maybe you can help me out, John, on this. I volunteer my time to educate students, parents, teachers, school districts on the dangers of fentanyl. And I'm volunteering my time. I'm not getting paid. I do it because I still believe I'm a public servant. But the issue of this neighbor of mine, he said, Ralph, nationwide we communicate. We can't catch up. We're behind. Even in the United States, we're behind on toxicology tests for testing for fentanyl. That's how immense this problem is. So, you talk about your question, Pat, and I hope I'm directing it to it, is that the capacity of if we have a difficulty catching up, just think about Central American countries and Mexico trying to catch up. And I'm not sure, and I'll be honest with you, I hate to say this, I'm not sure if they really want to find out. And so John, you're laughing. So let me just finish my thought process, and then you could hammer me if you want. But the point is that we have a major issue in this country, and it's not only being brought over, but that young people are buying using the social media, Snapchat and social platforms to buy these fentanyl pills. And we're losing, probably last year, we had probably about 10,000 overdoses. I would say about 50,000 of that was, poisonings of fentanyl. So go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, the reason I'm laughing is because you hit upon they're not wanting to see it. One of the core problems with dealing with transnational organized crime is corruption.
Yes.
We often talk about violence, and violence is there, and violence is what most people think of when they look at Mexico. And we'll see in the movie, we think about that in Brazil as well. The core issue, however, is corruption, which impedes the normal function of governance and gives criminal enterprises room to get into a competitive relationship with the state. Many of the states in Latin America are what I would call fragile states. They have immature democracy. They have high degrees of corruption. They don't have the capacity, and they don't necessarily have full perceptions of legitimacy and public trust by the public they serve, which gives room for criminals to jump into the space and extract resources and compound things. So the core issue, I would call, when that happens, I call that the lack of state solvency, where the state can be truly interrupted. Now, how I got into all this was back in the mid 2007 or 8, I was looking at insurgencies in general and wanted to look at insurgency potential in North America, but it didn't resonate. So I started looking at the criminal dynamics in Mexico and in Latin America, and found a treasure trove of research material that one person can't do. We need dozens of people to look at it, and they're complicated. It's not just the flow of illicit drugs; it's the flow of money laundering. Money laundering. LA has a trade-based money laundering issue. There's financial crimes that tie into circuits of corruption that are global. So it's really hard. And I mentioned before we talked that tomorrow I'm on a panel for the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime, their 24-hour conference, and I'm going to be on a panel looking at fentanyl and third generation gangs in Latin America in specific. So I can, would commend people to take.
I will bring you on again, John, and I'll look for another movie that speaks to this issue. And we had a 30-minute great discussion on what is going on south of the border. And I guess I got to get us to the movie, because I think we could go for another hour and a half talking about this stuff. So our movie is The Elite Squad. It's also the Trupa de Elite, if you say it in Portuguese. And it's a Brazilian crime drama. And let's see, I got the director is Andre Batista, directed by Jose Padilla. They spell it with an H-A. That's a little different, right? So, and the thing about when I did the research on this story, it was their number one film ever when it came out. So this had a real impact on Brazil. It was an award-winning show, and basically it talks about what they did in preparation for Pope John Paul's visit. I mean, we get a picture of Pope John Paul. He was visiting Brazil, and he wanted to go into the ghettos, the slums, the favelas, I think, if I got that right. And this is a picture of John Paul up there. And it was interesting. I did some research. Well, why would John Paul go there? And there is a move away from the Catholic faith to some degree into a more charismatic Christian faith or a secular thing. And so John Paul, who was a very conservative Catholic, wanted to go and visit these places, show support for the bishops and the Catholics that are in Portugal. So that and that has been ongoing. And in this story, basically, they asked this elite, and I put that in quotes, elite squad to go in and clean up the ghettos or the slums, because the Pope wanted to sleep and spend a night or a couple of nights in these slums. And the last thing the Brazilians wanted was the Pope to get hurt or anything happen when the Pope is there, of course, right? And they use extrajudicial means, murder, whatever, to clean the slums up, and that's probably the overall theme of what's going on. And then they get into the personalities in the movies. Did I kind of frame that right, Ralph?
Yeah, yeah. I think that was the initial mission. And then, first of all, let me go back. I want to commend John for recommending this movie. And the previous, back in September when we did another podcast, because it was really eye-opening. And John, I want to thank you because again, it enabled me to reach out to my friends in Brazil to give me some two different approaches, two different philosophical approaches from both these people. But I thank you, John, for that. But yeah, I think that you laid it out, and it's kind of then gets into the personalities. I mean, Nascimento, Fabio, and Matisse, the gentleman who was a lieutenant, and I just loved it, John and Pat. I really did. I mean, I'm looking forward to the second edition of that. I tried to get it, but I couldn't get it.
Well, I'll once we get through this one, I'll put that in the queue. I got a few other movies in the queue that other people recommended, and I just want to tell you, I did have Danny Regalado, I think, on last week. He wanted it. We did this, the New Centurions, which was a great
Yep.
story and a book by Joseph Wamba, and we were able to get into post-traumatic stress issues and police suicides and things like that, which should always be on the forefront. Any discussion we're talking about law enforcement, how to prevent those kinds of things. So the first scene is, I just labeled it Rio, and it just kind of lays out what's going on. And if you go into this scene, they talk about they have 700 slums. And now I wasn't sure if that was in Rio de Janeiro, which is where this is based, or if this was throughout Brazil. They have a ton of guns, as you see in this scene, and the cops are basically afraid to go in there. And this opening scene kind of lays out, if you're going to be a cop operating in the favelas, you either are going to be corrupt or you're going to have a hard road, right? You either go along and engage in the corruption that is existing. And I really, John, let's talk about that. You come into law enforcement, you might even be you believe that you're there to save the world, and you come into a very corrupted system. And how do you as an individual survive and maintain this is the challenge for most individuals as they go into a corrupted system like this. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and that is a problem clearly in Brazil. One of the interesting things, and you don't see it in this movie because it's underlying. In Brazil, the favelas, they have the main gangs that operate, but they're also what they call militias, which they're also called by some police militias. They're off-duty cops who served as vigilantes. So they don't discuss it overtly in this movie, but everybody in Brazil would know that's there. And those militias, like many other vigilante groups, once they got involved, they realized there was a lot of money in the corrupt, illicit part of the world, and they've in fact started dealing drugs themselves. And you see a little bit of this here, where the candidates, for the BOPE are trying to negotiate the corrupt system, and then they start to look to steal money to be able to do their job, which I recall happened once in the Arco Narco case here in Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, our own agency, back, in the late 80s. It becomes hard. The movie looks at the challenge, the dilemma that, the captain, Roberto Nascimento, was facing, and it's, causing him stress. He's feeling, not well. He's having problems dealing with his wife, who's, having a child, and it's confusing. And then you see the entire dynamic as the two young guys come in and move into the system to get integrated into the alternative method of policing. Right now, I think there's a true realization among the Brazilian senior police, prosecutors, and political community that those militias are, in fact, just gangs. And that, because they will call the drug gangs their factions or faccials. And they look at them as being drug trafficking organizations and downplay the control they have on the community. I'll give you an example. There's a set of favelas in Rio called the Complexo de Israel. And the guy, the current boss now, they built their own bridge over canals so they can maneuver inside their criminal enclave and avoid the police, right? So now you have the police being corrupt, you have the gangs being corrupt. They're both trying to govern that competitive process. It becomes really, really complicated. And, fortunately, our problems with corruption and policing in the United States are not as great as they are there. I tell my friends in Brazil when they tell me, well, our problem is corruption and you don't have it. I said, no, we have corruption. It's just not as endemic as you have it there. But the opportunity when there's power, power corrupts. It becomes important for us to realize that corruption could have a corrosive effect on how we govern, and we need to root that out and prevent it. If I was to talk to the Brazilians, fentanyl, drugs, bad. Impact on the community, public health, bad. Violence, spillover, absolutely atrocious. The real issue is the corruption and impunity, because that gives the criminals the maneuver room to truly challenge the state. So a whole lot of thoughts, but very, very complicated. Corruption is real. And I mean, obviously, most cops, and I will say, because people would say, well, how do you work in Latin America with cops? They're all corrupt. I'm like, no, they're not all corrupt.
Yeah.
There are many, many good men and women in the police service in Latin America that are trying to do a good job and serve their community. We need to enable them and ourselves to be able to avoid corruption and, avoid abuses and things like torture.
In that scene, there was a quote, and when a honest cop goes into the slums, bad things happen. And my note was either turn dirty or go to war. I don't know if that was a quote or just my thoughts. And they also have threats to their families. So there's a lot of reasons why they might cut the edges there just for self-preservation. And so Ralph, speak to that. I mean, we are talking. These communities are interconnected. They know who your family is. A lot of times you'll see these guys wear a mask when they do raids, so they don't get targeted. Their family, they don't know who they are. But when an honest cop goes in these situations, he's picking a side, and of course, then he becomes a target not only for the gangs, but potentially corrupt people that are in his own organization.
Well, I'll mention two things. First, I told you I talked to two friends in Brazil, and one of which liked the organization BOPE to help bring. He believed or she believed that it brought some safety net to the community. The other person believed that it was a little bit overzealous at times, and so there's the two different factions, but. Corrupt policing, I don't care where it is, the United States and Mexico, Central America, and I'll tell you this, working in El Salvador, I saw with some great cops. The problem that they see is the politicians, is the mordida. The mordida is the bite, and how much of the bite do they get a percentage of collaborating with drug distributions or drug syndicates. And you look at El Salvador, working side by side, working in the streets and serving search warrants with them. There was some outstanding ethical police in specialized units. They had a unit called GOPES, the Group Operation Especial Programa. Okay, and so the thing about that unit was like BOPE. But I worked with them. I saw how ethical it. The problem was on the streets when you have police getting paid $300 a month. They were taking part of extorting, just like what's going on in Brazil, the militia. And it's sad. Some of my friends in Brazil told me the militia. Here they are. They either left or fired from the police, and they joined, as John said. They joined, and now they're getting a mordida. They're getting a part of the bite of the drug distribution. So it's sad because it's the government that's got it. People, the leadership in the government's going to have to really be ethical and forthright. And that's the reason why I circle back to El Salvador. Why the people, my friends in El Salvador, respect Bukele right now, because he feels he's put a stranglehold on the pandillas, the gangs, yeah. And he's put him in, and he's practicing the matadora. That's what he's practicing. The matadora is the strong hand, and he's practicing that. Now, is it extreme? There's that corruption involved in it? But the previous two presidents, I understand, they aligned themselves too closely with some of them, MS and 18th Street, moving them around to lower level security prisons that enable them to still do their operation, not even in Central America, in Mexico, and in the United States. So corruption is such a disease, and I worry about our police agencies in the United States when transnational gangs may be getting more powerful, and also cartels are in 60 cities in the United States. What effect does that money have on our politicians? And John could probably speak more intelligently than me in that, but I know what I smell and see.
Well, let's roll into the next scene, and it says, "I am no regular cop," and it's really talking about BOPE, and they're basically they show extrajudicial killings in the beginning here, where they're just going to suppress some of the drug gangs, and that kind of speaks to what you're talking about in El Salvador, where they're just rounding them up in an extrajudicial way. No real judicial system involved there, or certainly nothing that looks like the Bill of Rights that we have here. That's what's going on in El Salvador, and that is what's going on in the slums, and that's going on with BOPE, and that's where I think John talked about. Where does that end? And when you do too much of that, you lose the faith of the people. John, go ahead and talk about the tough hand versus a more enlightened approach.
Yeah, no, it's complicated, and it ties into the situation with the mano dura historically in Central America and the approaches in Rio, which have led to in the BOPE extrajudicial activity, violence, which clearly violates the norms of the rule of law. One of the problems that occurs, and the current crackdown in El Salvador has, according to reports, cut the influence of the Maras, Mara Salvatrucha and 18th Street, which are rivals in general, but are key players in that criminal ecosystem there, has cut their numbers ostensibly on the street by 2/3, which means there's a third of the folks still there. The criticism comes where they create a state of exception and pull people in without the normal due process, get them into incarceration. And that has two views. People who've been victimized by gangs think that's great. They'd like to have that. People that emphasize human rights are worried that there'll be spillover. And some innocents do get caught in those large, kind of round them up activities. Go get all the gangs, let's roll them up, and we'll worry about the rule of law later. The other issue that comes in, they're creating a large super prison in El Salvador. You have to remember, prisons do not inhibit the activity of organized crime groups. In fact, most significant mafias have their origins in the correctional systems. Our own MA grows out of California prisons. The Camorra in Naples starts in prison. The two major gangs in Brazil started out as prison gangs. Comando Vermelho and the PCC, or the First Capital Command, both started in prison. So you have to look, can you radicalize criminals in prison? We've seen that with jihadis in France and in Belgium and elsewhere. I'm not saying you don't address crime, you have to address it decisively. But the rule of law, I think if you cut that, you have a long-term issue with legitimacy. Because when you incarcerate people who weren't involved in a criminal enterprise, the folks that would support the government may not. So it's a matter of calibrating the threat. So you have to be decisive. If you allow these crimes to go, and we have a lot of discussion with people, like I mentioned, I think during our preamble, because of the high level of police violence in Brazil, much of which is appropriate because they're responding to gangsters executing, directly confronting, firing upon cops when they're conducting lawful warrant services. It gets blown out of proportion. But the fact that some cops have created militias that are de facto criminal enterprises in their own right, that erodes the legitimacy of the police. So I think we need to develop, because it's all about governance, right?
Right.
It's all about how you govern, who's sovereign, who preserves the rights. You saw the gang leader in the community there saying, well, I'm the one who allows the NGOs to function. You think the police, provide safety in this community? I do. That's that competition for government. Now, I think, believing in the rule of law, that we need to be decisive. We need to prosecute criminals aggressively, but we can't ignore human rights. We can't ignore prohibitions on torture and execution. So it's hard.
Well, Ralph, before you get going, let's bring up the plot map to show the breadth of the problem in Brazil. And Ralph, go ahead.
Listening to John, and it just sparked some thoughts. And this is my thought process, John and Pat in the audience. When I was out there with OSS detectives, we had it was a triangle: suppression, prevention, intervention. So when the mission, and when I first went down to El Salvador, it was to look at how the director of the Policía Nacional was Rodrigo Avila, and we had a great discussions. We went out in the street. He said, can we implement, prevention, intervention, and suppression? But what they also was talking about community policing. The problem, and I want to hear from John on this, that I saw, my estimation, working in patrols, a lot of different cities in San Salvador and outskirts, Soyapango. The problem is, John and Pat in the audience, was their approach to policing was a military model. Their approach is a military model with 6 or 5 people in the back of a pickup truck going through the community with masks on. And here I was with some of my guys going out, and we're talking to the community, and the community members would love to see the cops in a different format. But I believe the edict at the time was that, I don't know if the cops were so intimidated by the gangs because of the amount of murders that were committed. And also, I got to say this, I don't discount their concern, John and Pat in the audience, because the time I went in, 36 cops were killed on buses because they didn't have cars themselves. And they would ride the public buses that were being extorted, and the gang members are on them. Okay. And also, until we, meaning LAPD and the FBI, influenced Rodrigo to let these cops go home with their guns, they were going on the buses without guns, and the gang members knew who they were on the bus. So I don't mean to protract this, but how do you implement the policing that us three know, and the audience who in the United States knows is effective when it's done properly? But when you have this other problem going on, and I don't blame the cops for being intimidated or afraid.
Well,
so
I think
anyway,
the plot map on here shows 15% to Brazil. Brazil's a big country.
Yeah,
15,
well, this is
go ahead and explain it.
Yeah, this is just Rio de Janeiro. It's just
okay.
showing. It's just that's you're basically seeing, the bay. If you think Rio's the city on the bay, right? In Rio de Janeiro itself, the Red Command and one of their splinter groups, the Tercero Commando and Amigos Los Amigos, they both split off. Those gangs in the red, and I use the color red because you see the gangster there. He's wearing a flamenco shirt, which flamenco is the local, one of the local Rio football club soccer team. They dominate 15.5% of the territory in Rio de Janeiro. The militias, which are police vigilante derivatives, have just become essentially gangs themselves, control 41 neighborhoods, or 57.5% of the community. So you have just here the blues, the militias, the reds, the CV, the other colors, all the other little smaller groups. They're battling over who controls the illicit economy and parts of the gray economy, right? Because corruption goes both ways. So you can't have gangs dominate communities without corrupt politicians.
Well, let's, the scene that we talked about, or we just had, and Martin, go ahead and roll into the next scene, Neto and Matias, because then we'll discuss our two main characters here. But there was a lot of guns too, and we need to get into the guns. Just how prevalent is are guns in these slums? Can Ralph, can you speak to that?
Well, I cannot speak to Brazil. John can speak more intelligently on that, but I could tell you this. Working in El Salvador and been around the country, during the Civil War with the Comunistas, the communists, and Sandinistas and stuff working in there, there were still buried weapons within El Salvador and Central American countries during that time that the gangs actually got control of. And so they I don't know how they found them. They found them, and so here they are. And I remember a murder scene we went to. A rival gang run up a hill from a soccer field that we rolled out to in a town near Iberia outside of San Salvador, and an AK-47 shot this guy run up a hill away from the rival gang 18th Street, blew his head off, and we look at the weapon, and it's a weapon that some of the police there were saying that was back during a time during during the 80s, early 80s, late 70s and stuff. So the weapons are prevalent not only from people who make allegations, and probably maybe some of it's true from us, from the United States, but a lot of it was from the communist infiltration through Central America during the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
So, John, the question to you: how prevalent are the guns there? Is the scene realistic that we saw there?
The scene is realistic. In fact, a friend of mine, a deputy prosecutor, who's probably the third in the public ministry, sent me yesterday a Brazilian. They're trying to teach me how to speak Portuguese. So he sends me a Brazilian news report talking about the military police in Rio de Janeiro. So capturing like 41 high capacity rifles, to include 50 caliber and 30 caliber, 50 caliber submachine guns. And he looks at me and says, "This isn't normal policing," and I agree. Just a couple days ago, my colleague Robert Bunker and I published a piece on M134 miniguns being used by the cartels in Mexico. So belt-fed, almost Gatling gun type, if you will, an older weapon that is mounted on vehicles, because a human couldn't really, unless you were like Hulk Hogan or something, actually effectively wield that. The weapons are there. Higher caliber small arms are there. They use improvised armored fighting vehicles in Mexico. There's some evidence of that in Rio. So yes, guns are there. The trade is there. In Mexico, a large number of the guns are illegally trafficked across the U.S. border to Mexico, and that's the big pet peeve of Mexico. Our reach of our criminal system doesn't get that far down to Brazil. They make their own down there, and there's also, international arms deals and sales. So weapons are there. It's a matter of capacity. Now, to tie back on how you can address this, because Ralph, you mentioned that this isn't normal policing, and it isn't. I call it intra-conflict policing, and I think the solution is full spectrum policing, with the foundation being community policing through the ability to do counter criminal insurgency, to the ability to do riot control, organized crime control, and I see a spectrum. I see a need for militarization is a buzzword that can go both ways. Being a military police organization does not necessarily mean you can't be effective community police. The gendarmerie in France traditionally was stronger at community policing than the national police, which was once known as the Sûreté, because they were traditionally viewed as more of a political policing organization. Now the two have converged, and they are mirror images of each other, which is actually starting to happen with the civil and military police in Brazil. But one of the things that occurs when they do these high visibility crackdowns, and things like, in the sheriff's department, special enforcement bureau might do, or things that you might see in New York, you would call it the tactical police force, a tactical patrol force rather, the TPF, that would go out and try to do this. They would use BOPE, their special operations crew, to set the stage for more pacification type of. They have a thing in Rio was called the UPP, or the Unidade de Policia Pacificadora, and they were very, very effective. They would get out there, and they still use the pickup trucks put the guys in the back like they do in Mexico. That's good for response, but you really need to get in there and talk to the community. The UPP at their height, which was basically up to about 2000, but 2009 was their heyday when they were getting ready to deal with another Olympics or
Yeah, let me cut in there, John. So their strategy seems to be when they're having a global event, whether it's the Pope visiting or the Olympics or whatever, is they use these extrajudicial methods to clean up and get it under control to some degree, so they can have the event without being embarrassed.
Yes,
I guess that's
yes,
probably there.
But in part, the BOPE would be that kind of. I don't think you can condone extrajudicial. I think that's been there. I don't know if that's an official state response or not. But when the UPP came, the UPP is a counterinsurgency, but not a high violence thing. They use social services. The problem with the UPP, and the Brazilians are trying to advocate for bringing them back. They're very effective. They weren't extrajudicial. They were transparent. They worked in the community, brought community policing. The problem is they're expensive.
Yeah, well, we're coming up on a break here, but I want to catch us up a little bit on. So we have our two main guys, Neto and Matias, if I say that name right, and they basically entered the regular police, and they've been given duties that are not really policing. One is focused on fixing the cars, and the other one is doing complaint paperwork. Martine, how much time do we have before our break?
We're just on time for it.
Okay, go ahead and do the break, and I'll catch us up after the break.
There's only one location on the internet where you can get it all. Movie, TV, and comic industry. News and rumor analysis. Official scoops from Geekosity magazine. Reviews and interviews. So, when you need it to be Sunday, there's only one place to go, mate. Pop Culture Minefield. Where they're always talking nerd stuff. Right, jog on then.
Well, welcome back to Pop Culture Minefield Morning Coffee with the Chief. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the show, share it with a friend, and of course make a comment. Of course, we do have a comment from our audience. Sadly, that is how a lot of things work down there. He's talking about policing south of the border. But also, if you're watching us on Rumble, there on that channel, you follow us on Rumble. It's Pop Culture Minefield on Rumble. Morning Coffee with the Chief. You like the show there as well, make a comment and share with a friend. By doing all these things, you help to promote the channel, and so more people can hear great discussions like we're having here today. So our two main characters do enter. They're young guys, and I think I want to talk a little bit about the racial makeup of Brazil. But you have to understand that there was transnational slavery that was going on. They were bringing people over from Africa. That's why Matias he's black, right? So you have a mix of European, indigenous, and blacks in Brazil, and they've mixed there for hundreds of years now. And so you have a very kind of diverse-looking environment. I don't know if race really plays out in this in this stuff or not, but most people, unfortunately, our schools don't really teach history anymore that well, and so you wouldn't really know. That's why we have black Brazilians and Latino-looking Brazilians, and certainly some people that look European. But our two characters, they enter into the regular police force, which is corrupt, and they're not giving any meaningful duties, probably because they want to either corrupt them along the way before they give them meaningful duties, or they're not sure of them. I'm not really. I think this is just they gotta do the grunt work before they're able to come in, and ultimately, you see, BOPE is ends up being their target where they want to go to. Do you want to speak a little bit about entering as a rookie into this kind of environment, Ralph?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting the way they started off with was it Nieto and Matisse, and I believe they put them on. Nieto went to the inspecting the vehicles, and I sense that was a feeling out stage. Or could they manipulate this individual? And he got exposed as he could see some of the corruption with monies. I think it startled him, and then with Matisse also being brought in, he's got attention and stuff, and how they shut him down when he had an idea how to reorganize all the reports and stuff. And he said he could redeploy the forces to make things better, and they shut him down. I think his eyes opened up and realized like what's really going on here. And I thought it was interesting. But guess what? I know that during the time of friends of mine and law enforcement, some of them have gone through some of those things too. That people are going to test you. How far will you be tested? Do you compromise yourself? And John brought up an interesting point in the beginning of this conversation: Arco Narco. I inherited narcotics in 2009 as a captain, and two sergeants who did some paperwork on that, and that's how it worked. A sergeant tested his detectives and how far they would go to take certain things, and that's how it starts. I mean, you look at even the Special Investigation Unit in the early 70s at NYPD, who John knows and I know, and Pat. That's how it starts. But I give both those men in the movie. They tried their best, and I look forward to talking about how they got recruited into BOPE. Was it because of their intestinal fortitude to really stand up and really try to do the right thing? And Matisse was really interesting also. He'd go and get his law degree and standing in front of all those liberal students in there. I thought that was an interesting dynamics part of the whole premise of the movie too. And I give him kudos to that.
On both of these characters, so it's interesting. One of the scenes, and I think it might come up, or maybe I didn't target it, but they stole the brand new engine out of one of the cars.
Yes,
and put a junk engine in there, and so it just indicates that the corruption is systemic and it goes throughout. And I got another scene later, which I thought was pretty funny, that shows the corruption internally between the officers and their supervisors, as well as some guy trying to take a vacation.
Can I just say one thing, please? Sure. So I just thought it was interesting. You brought up the symbol of BOPE, right?
Yeah.
Well, I still have my pin for OSS, and it's kind of sick. I could go get it in my office, but it's kind of with the knife, and stuff, and so. But I looked at that, John and Pat in the audience, and it was. I understand why we had that, but I got to tell you, I work in the streets with OS investigators. And we didn't do anything. In fact, I was questioned by two of my friends in Brazil about that because they knew what I did. And I said, we didn't function that way.
No.
I mean, and it's hard for them to process that because what they watch the media about the United States, they think we're just like that in a way too. So
but we have a lot of the symbolisms of that, even though we don't necessarily, because that we purged a lot of the offensive symbolism out over the last couple of years. But yeah, you're right, Ralph. I did notice that. I was going to bring it up, but we got into more meaty discussions. But I need to move forward. We need to catch up, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pope. And so if we got a picture of the Pope, and this is what inspired it, is his visit to the favelas and to Brazil. But also, John, we had the Olympics. We've had other world events in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, because it is a world-class city, even though it's got some pretty world-class problems. And the politicians really don't want bad things to happen when these things are here. Certainly, they didn't want anything bad to happen to the Pope when he visited. So speak to the challenges of a society that has these corrupted behaviors, yet they want to be on the world stage and they don't want to be embarrassed. Politicians don't want to be embarrassed.
Yeah. I'll say this 1,000 times. It's complicated. One, politicians shy away, and this isn't unique to Brazil nor Mexico. They shy away from these contentious issues because they don't sell well. And you talked about AMLO ignoring the fact that there's fentanyl in Mexico, which is insane. Except, populism is dangerous, whether it comes from the left or the right. and it enables people to run on emotion rather than fact. And I'm not, one of being overly critical of the political dynamics in all of these Latin American nations, like in the United States, are complicated. There are, on the surface, it looks like there are left-right issues or there are race issues. They're largely class issues. The distinction in Brazil, which is a multicultural community, a society like ours, they're largely related to class, and how race and class interact is complicated. I thought it was interesting how they were talking about Foucault in that discussion in the law school, which is, Foucault is an important scholar of class relations and power of the state. It's way more philosophical than most cops read. I think seeing the cop in the movie do that shows something I can appreciate. Somebody trying to bring the rule of law to the function, which is
that the French theorist you're talking about, Foucault?
Foucault, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and there's many other philosophers that play into this. Some of them more democratic, some of them in the global South more on the Marxist leftist side of the world. I'd say Foucault's probably on the left. He's not as far left as people like Fanon and stuff that were used to justify Che Guevara and things like that, or Carlos Marighella, who was the urban guerrilla from Brazil. I think the complex mix of race and class through large parts of Latin America and even in the United States to a larger degree now than I would have imagined in recent time are really complicated. Because like Brazil's Supreme Court, for example, what they call it, the Supremo Tribunal Federal, actually made it so police operations in the favelas in Rio are prohibited unless they get judicial review, because there have been large-scale attacks. Now, the cops look at that and say, well, these guys have machine guns. They shoot at helicopters. They, are highly violent. They call them territorial gangs in a lot of ways. They control real territorial control. So how do you thread that needle? And I tell the cops there, you do so by following the rule of law. And most cops want to do the job right. You saw that in the movie. Even the ones who succumbed to the torture want to do their job right. So how do you do that? You need political support. Most people do not understand the function of police in society and how they work. Places like Brazil and Mexico, the police don't operate the way we do, open, transparent, interacting with the community regularly. The UPP was the exception in Brazil, and they cut that out. Places in the United States that had to deal with public corruption also tried to limit police contact with the community, and then put us, this is the double-edged sword. They put us in radio cars to stay away from having direct, conduct, so we couldn't do corruption. In New York, they won't let cops get a free cup of coffee, which, I understand the sentiment, but I'm not sure that is really a slippery slope, right? Obviously, you saw in this movie the young lieutenant there saying, "No, I pay for my coffee." I mean, and I think those of us know when somebody offers you a gratuity, you leave them a nice tip. So we're all even, right? You don't want to offend somebody and say no, but it's problematic. So when you have a Supreme Court, and they view this as a left or right issue, it's more complicated than that. Telling the cops you can't go there, yet the cops know that they're being victimized, right? The one incident one of many incidents that drove the Supreme Court in Brazil to limit police interaction was that the number of police killings in Brazil had risen, and some of that is perhaps tactics, some of it is perhaps corruption, some of it is perhaps the fact that the gangs are directly confronting the police using high power weapons. And so it's not like cops good, criminals bad. It blends. It's murky, and we all know that police work's murky. So how do you deal with that? You deal with it by, I think, the strong imposition of transparency, adhering to the rule of law, and knowing. See, when we talk about militarization, from the American point of view, the military and police don't mix. In parts of Europe where you have gendarmeries, like in France and in Spain with the Civil Guard, or in the Netherlands with the Marchusaree and others, it's not so unique. I would argue in places like this, you need some military discipline. You can't go against people using improvised armored fighting vehicles and infantry tactics with unarmed British Bobby, right?
I was just in Rome, and I had to look at they had two different. They had the military police, and you saw the regular police.
Yeah, the Carabinieri.
And I had to look it up and go, what are these guys? So Ralph, dope dealers in Rio. So, and here's a question I just thought of that. So it is. We saw 15% of Rio de Janeiro controlled by these gangs who are also selling dope, obviously, to the communities and outward. But then the 57% of the militias, are they both in the dope trade now? Because that's a lot of area where you're slinging dope. What do you think, Ralph?
Well, obviously John has been there, but I could tell you, if you have 15% and another 57% of police corrupt working collaboratively with drug syndicates, organized crime, we have a problem. And so my two friends I spoke to yesterday and the day before, they really actually believe somehow, and John, you could comment on this after I make my statement, but they share with me, they believe they got to start all over and recreate the police department. And truly, it comes back to training. And another thing is this, just from the movie, but I related to some of my experience working in Mexico and El Salvador and in Costa Rica is this. Look at the leadership of the young officers that they had engaging during briefings that I saw in the movie, and in the philosophical approach, more or less telling them, just do this, and they could see. Look at the one officer. Let me go back. The one officer who went up to ask for vacation.
Oh yeah, I was coming up that scene next.
So he pulls the drawer out, and there's all money in there to show him basically this is what's really important. So how do the young officers move forward to be an ethical, legitimate, professional law enforcement agency? And my two friends said, Ralphie, this is why we wish we had guys, and I took a compliment on this, and to compliment you guys too, and the people we work with throughout careers, they wish they had that level of ethical leadership within the organization. And that's really sad, because if we don't have, and John may have said this maybe in a more higher level term than I did, is this: if we don't have truly ethical law enforcement work in the streets, the public does not respect you. And I wrote down here, trust. If you don't have trust, my two friends in Brazil, they don't trust the cops.
Yeah.
And that's sad.
Well, so dope dealers in Rio, John, just how prevalent is it? I mean, and the other thing, they call them dope dealers, but they do other things too, right? So they're.
Well, all of these groups have gone beyond drug trafficking organizations into other crimes. Their biggest crime is extortion. That's where they make their money, right? Extortion, extort the cops, pay the cops, extort the business, pay the business. The CV, the Commander Romello in Rio, is also engaged in huachicoleo, you'd call it in Mexico, illicit taps of, in Brazil's case, Petrobras, pipelines, and then reselling the oil and gasoline to the community. Mexican cartels do that all across the border. There's even a cross-border trade into Texas, and Tamaulipas, Nuevo Leon doing that. They're engaged in things like counterfeit goods, just like our gangsters. They do. They run the cable TV operations, and they blend into gray area stuff where they dominate legal stuff. I think the most telling, the violence in a movie is exacerbated, although it's certainly there. The real issue was who controls that NGO that operated there had to ask permission from the gang leader to be there. That is a case of what I would call a criminal enclave, where you have a territorial gang that is supplanting governments. There are places in Sao Paulo where the PCC, the analog, or it's actually the rival of the CV, actually extorts money. They engage in large-scale bank robberies, right? They call it the Novo Cangaçal. The Cangaçal was a period in the late 19th, early 20th century where you had large-scale roaming bandits, brigands, not unlike what we had in our Wild West or the Australians had in the Outback, right? They're back there doing it, like using combined arms. They're adding drones to their armamentarium, so they have small unmanned aerial systems with weaponized capability attacking the cops. One case we documented, Dr.
Hold on a second, John. Hey, Martine, as we talk about this, go ahead and start the vacation Palo scene and let John finish his thoughts, and then I'll make my comments on that scene.
Yeah, you actually see the large bank robberies cross-border. So you see activity by the PCC in Paraguay, but I'll tell you, the gang that we're talking about in Rio, the Red Command, they operate in Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, Venezuela, Colombia. So they do drugs, they do money laundering, they do extortion. I think they do sex trafficking, human trafficking. Mm-hmm. So they're polycrime organizations, which means there's ample opportunity for corrupt cops to extract resources, just as the gangs extract resources from the community. So it's a hard problem. I do believe that there are very strong efforts in Brazil by professionalized cops to change the equation and bring it in. And I'm actually the senior police officer that I've dealt with there are really trying to address the issue.
Well, in this scene, Paulo trying to take a vacation, he's actually talking to a sergeant. He says he hasn't had a vacation in 4 years. And as Ralph talks about, he opens up the drawer and there's a stack of money. To me, it's like, hey, if you want a vacation, you got to pay.
Exactly.
Which indicates, and of course, Nieto is finding out, parts are being stolen out of the cars, new parts are being stolen, they're not getting what they want. So it is systemic corruption deeply throughout the police department here, to the point where you have to pay a bribe to get a vacation, which I think that just it was a good capstone for people to understand just how corrupt it was. The sergeant said, hey, man, you pay me, you get a vacation. And if the other guy pays you more, does he get the vacation? I mean, where does this end? And of course, Paulo doesn't pay him. He just wants to take his family on a vacation. But I really thought that really demonstrated just how bad it is. Government parts being stolen. These are the things that I wrote down. Endemic corruption, falsifying reports, all of that stuff is happening here. And it causes our main characters, Nieto and Matias, to be disillusioned, right? So, I mean, Ralph, you already kind of brought up this scene where the guy's just trying to take a vacation. What do you think?
Oh, when I think it's horrible, but you know something? If it's in the movie, things like that do happen.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it. I'll give you an example. I was teaching down in Mexico in the state of Guanajuato, the police there, and I was told to speak about leadership and ethics. Do you know that the command staff, the lieutenants and the sergeants, did not believe what I was professing about how important it is to lead and to be an ethical supervisor? They believe in the mordida. They believe in that all cops take a bite of money on traffic stops, like we just saw here in this example. Case in point, in 2008, I was sent down to Mexico City to meet with the legat there from Mexico, and I met with Onero Luna Garcia. And I mentioned his name because he was just prosecuted in New York, for giving information up. He's a minister of defense, and he was equally when I met him, in charge of the Mexican federal police. I trained 40 of his people, and they would tell me when in the United States, they would tell me that, what you're telling me is really important, but guess what? We can't follow that because our leaders of our department and federal and municipal and local police, they're not following this. It doesn't bode well. Two of the people commanders that I trained were killed within the year that I trained them. I found out later on. Why, I don't know. I didn't inquire. I didn't want to inquire because I was afraid what to find out. But that's sad. It's sad what really the mentality and the philosophical approach. So how do they improve? And this is a discussion we could go on for hours. In a classroom environment and lectures.
Well, there's two things I want to address, and the first is to just to mitigate the criticism of the folks struggling down there. I had you on, Ralph, and we did the French Connection, right? And following the French Connection, the folks that you talked about, the Special Investigation Unit, they found out that the heroin seized in the French Connection, great bust by Popeye Doyle and their narcotics team there, was getting ripped off out of the evidence locker by New York police and then sold on the streets. So I say that, and I bring up that story because they face a challenge that we have faced in this country. Maybe it wasn't quite as systemic, but it existed and it was real, and it was really hard to turn that around in New York, maybe in Chicago, and certainly in LA in the 50s and early 60s probably. So I want to say that in defense of the men and women in law enforcement or the criminal justice system down there. It's hard when you enter in a corrupted system to turn it around, and we've lived that, and I think that's a fair comment. What do you think, Ralph?
No, and listen, when I say it from all my heart, I really respected every one of those people that came up from Mexico, even when I worked in El Salvador. I respect them all, though, especially the ones that really want to do the right thing. And it comes back to the higher levels of government, because it's from top down. And I think you're right. I think we look at NYPD, look at LA County Sheriffs, look at LAPD. But I think it goes back to the academy. We talked about this once before, the three of us. We have to and truly ingrain about how important it is to be ethical, professional in this type of career. And you cannot compromise yourself. I don't care if it's a cup of coffee, as John said, you leave a tip on a counter, and we have to stick to that philosophical approach, because that's the only way you're going to turn around the public to trust us. I always believe this: you have a relationship plus trust equates to effectiveness. I don't care what form of government or public sector it is, or private sector.
Hey, so we got the next scene that we need to get to is steal the payoff. And so our heroes here, Nieto and Matias, they're frustrated. They see the corruption. They decide that they're going to steal the payoff of the police to fix the cars, so that they have some appropriate equipment. I mean, they do talk about not having the right equipment and not being able to get the weapons they need to defend themselves and things like that. So these guys get frustrated, and they're gonna solve the problem with by using the problem against itself, right? By stealing the payoffs. And of course, that doesn't go well for their boss. And these guys, once this happens, they get assigned to even lesser or menial duties. They want to completely out of. They're assigned to the kitchen, I guess. I don't understand if it works this way, where you're kind of like firemen and you're cleaning dishes and things like that, or not in police down there. But that's what they're assigned to do. And there were problems with this. But after this scene, the corrupt people want to hold somebody accountable. So Martin, you could roll right into the next scene after this, and that would be the setup, right? So they do. People do get frustrated, and John, this does happen. Good people do they take action, even if it's not well thought out. That is probably driven by the right reasons, but they do it the wrong way. What do you think?
No, I think there's a tension, right? Because I've worked with cops in Mexico and Brazil, El Salvador, like Ralph, and the cops I've worked with, and they were straight up good guys. And people would ask, well, how can you work down in Mexico? Well, because they're good cops, because if not, I wouldn't be alive, because I've done field work down there. I've been there. Yes, there's corruption. But you know what? When I came into policing, it was in the aftermath of the Knapp Commission, right?
Yeah.
And the Knapp Commission, depending upon where you stood, a lot of cops didn't like it, because a lot of cops weren't corrupt. They thought it put a tarnish on their badge, but they all knew they were bad cops. We all know they were bad cops. It's not a surprise. We've seen people in our own past organization prosecuted for criminal activity or brutality, and so it's part of power being there. There's what's different here is we have taken discrete steps to root out corruption. The Knapp Commission was an example. The Molland Commission was an example. In Australia, the Wood Royal Report, the Wood Royal Commission looked at rooting out corruption in New South Wales. I'll tell you, the Metropolitan Police, one of once and still one of the finest police agencies in the world, has had recent issues with endemic corruption, right? So it happens. You need to counter it with transparency. And I think what you see in parts of Latin America is a lack of transparency that allows corruption to exist and fester. Not that there aren't good people trying to root it out. There always are. Some of the courts try to root it out. Some of the judicial officials may be corrupt. We've seen examples. Some of it comes down to the levels of endemic violence from organized crime are so high that some people seek, a pax mafiosa or, pax narcotica, right? They want a narco piece, so they will work with one criminal enterprise over another. It's been alleged that when the Zetas were the top criminal cartel threat in Mexico, the most violent, that some parts of the government favored the Sinaloa cartel and played one cartel against another. That certainly happened with dealing with organized crime, not just in Mexico, but certainly everywhere. So how do you do that? You do it through open transparency. You do it by reinforcing the rule of law. You do it by what some of us would call police diplomacy. You bring professional police organizations in to work and mentor other organizations, and while keeping a good eye on our own house, because if we're not careful, these things will come here. There are parts of the Rio Grande Valley where there is a high degree of corruption, where what we call supervisors in California, they call the county judge, where county judges are in the pay of the cartels. And it's just not unknown to the public down there. There've been corrupt police officials, corrupt sheriffs. Fortunately, the FBI here has a public corruption unit and roots that stuff out, but it's a constant effort to get there. I think the way you solve it is by inspiring, positive professionalism. Now, militarization, I'll just say this to close this up. Militarization is often seen as a solution to corrupt police because traditionally the military, particularly in Latin America, was the least corrupt public organ there was. The problem is when you put the military into policing and the military isn't trained to do policing, they don't have the mindset or ethos or the command climate that all three of us recall. Sometimes the cops become corrupt.
Yeah, I was remembering down in Mexico, they did bring the military in. They used the Navy, who I guess was least corrupt for a while there, and
they still are the least corrupt.
Yeah, and
the Marines, yeah.
They brought the Marines in to take down a cartel guy, and the Marine that was point on that, they celebrated him in the media, and the cartels went and killed him and his family. I don't know if you remember that. That was a few years ago. So, I mean, even when you're trying to bring in your least tainted organizations to do this, there is a real risk for them, and that shows the reach that these guys have, and which really sets up our next scene. I had them do steal the payoff and then go into the setup, and the setup is the boss of these guys, Fabio, is they believe that he was part of this, the corrupt police there, and he's asked to go pick up a payoff, which he believes is going to be an effort to kill him. And he tells Metis and Nieto that's what's happening. They kind of get the high ground on what's going on here, and they inadvertently shoot somebody, and there's a gunfight in the favela with the police, and these guys are trapped. The Fabio and whoever's alive is also trapped, outgunned, and BOPE is coming to their rescue as well. And this is where they first interact with our two main characters, BOPE with our two main characters. But that there is a cost, as I talked about with the Marine. You stand up, you do the right thing, and you're celebrated for it. You can get targeted by these gangs. Fabio had no idea what his guys were doing, but they still think he's guilty, and he thinks he's getting set up to be murdered. And that's a reality, right, Ralph? That's a reality that these guys face.
It's a hard reality and a frightening thing to think that, first of all, the leaders of the organization there in that movie were planning Fabio's hit, because they feel like maybe he was not supporting them, and to think that, and for him to be in that car, that police car, and as a setup. And I got to give the credit in the movie to Neto and Matisse for having his back and going there. But Neto was a little bit trigger happy, I guess, was described in the movie, a little nervous, and he shot the one of the people that started off that whole firefight. But isn't it frightening to think that? I mean, God forbid. I mean, it just I pray to God that that things like that don't happen, but they do. And obviously, tell them I'm busy, John.
I will.
No, but yeah, I agree with you, and it's this scene. I thought it was really a very interesting scene. But the other thing I wanted to mention, from my two friends in Brazil told me, they said, Ralph, and I can't pronounce it in Portuguese, but in essence, the translation is lost bullets. And they both told me that the thing that happens in these favelas is between the police and these gangs, the drug leaders, shooting in these homes sometimes, John, and you've probably seen it down there. I've seen it in other countries. They're made out of plywood, and it's innocent people getting killed, children, everybody, because of the exchange of fire, because they go into multiple residents that are made of like plywood. And I mean, I looked up some of the statistics. 62,000 people get killed a year in Brazil, and behind that is India, and then United States, and and then Mexico. So it's very sad for the young people. And my two friends down there to say it's really frightening what's going to happen to our youth if the cartels and the drug syndicates continue taking over. What's going to happen to the youth of Brazil in the future? Are they going to all align with gangs and just be soldiers of that, or are they going to? I mean, and especially in the favelas. This one person told me it's like there's no hope.
Well, I think in the story, the example I gave in Mexico, the young Marine, because he wasn't like a general or anything. He was just a young Marine, and they didn't like the fact that they were creating this hero worship around this Marine, and they killed him and his family. And that's the terrorism part of this. They're sending that message, and I think after this raid, I don't really do a lot of scenes. The next scenes I talk about, and we'll do it in a minute, is when they are trying to get on the squad. But once they do this, it ends up in the paper, and now the NGO that operates in the favela is threatened. The people who vouched for Matisse, who has been coming into there, because Matisse ends up on the front page or in the paper, they recognize him, and they feel like this NGO has betrayed the favela, who has given them permission to operate in the area. There is an exchange there. Not only do they give them permission to operate in the area and at the college, but they, one of the guys is dealing dope at the college, right? So there is this cooperative relationship, and they actually kill one of the girls that basically is friends with Matisse, and her boyfriend, I think it's her boyfriend, and they light him on fire with the tires. John, one, is that a realistic depiction of what is still going on, or is that dramatized? Do they go to that extreme in killing people today?
Sadly, endemic violence is part of the criminal cartel, third generation gang milieu. They use violence as a way to enforce. They use it two ways. They use it symbolically to let their rivals and the state know that they will interact. They use it instrumentally to take out direct rivals, people who they thought betrayed them. You would often think that violence is bad for their business, but there's an emotive component. Like the drug leader in this film thought he was betrayed. He gave them room to operate, and he betrayed the trust. just when I was down in Brazil, there were 3 physicians killed in Barra da Tijuca. It's like an expensive upper middle class, upper class neighborhood on the beach, kind of south of the bay, place where most tourists would want to go. And they the sicarios, the hitmen, mistakenly thought that 3 physicians looked like some rival gangsters, so they killed them. Well, I'll tell you what, the next day, the gang, right, went and killed the 3 guys who killed the wrong guys. So yes, they use violence instrumentally. It's real. It's often brutal. In Mexico, it's not unknown of to have a cartel deliver a cooler full of heads, of decapitated heads. It's not unknown for them to do what I call corpse messaging, to write gory messages on the bodies, film them, and then send them. They're starting to film their activity with GoPro cameras direct. So yeah, violence is part of it. It's used as a tool, and it's not unique to Brazil nor Mexico nor El Salvador. It happens everywhere. Sadly, it happens less frequently here. But in those places, we have what we call narcocultura, right? Where there's a social modification of the norms within a community. A report just came out the end of September. It was kind of really notable, where a group of scholars working on their PhD did some analysis and determined that in Mexico, not Brazil, but Mexico, that the cartels were the 5th largest employer in the country. So
Wow.
they have.
Wow.
When I first started studying Mexican cartels and transnational crime, I started looking at Brazil and Mexico and narrowed my dissertation down to Mexico because it would have been like a behemoth of a book. I started to realize that cartels were shaping not only the criminal economy, but also politics. And that, when I first came up with that, and this is like 2010, and it was controversial, and I got a lot of blowback. Now I open up the news now, people say cartels have political dimensions. I'm like, no shit. But and they always have. It's just because it's not part of the licit or the economy doesn't mean that they don't shape social norms. When we first met, and I first went to work in South Central Los Angeles, when the Crips and Bloods were a thing, and they were looked at as brutal, and they were using rap music as ways to shape community perception. We had the same thing here. It hasn't gone to the degree it's going in Mexico, but they do alter the nature of how communities operate. The positive thing is once they start to get political control, they get captured by it, and they have a need to be seen by their community as being legitimate. So that could moderate the violence. I say could because they're going to do whatever's good for business. And
I remember, as you say that, John, there was a great movie, and I think it was Godfather 2, where Hyman Roth, played by the great actor Lee Strasberg, says, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel," I think is what he says. "We're bigger than U.S. Steel." And he was talking about the Italian mafia, if you can remember that quote, which really reinforces what you're saying. The 5th largest employer, I think you said, in Mexico is the cartels. So, and people owe allegiance to the people that are paying the bills for them too, even if they're in the more legitimate side of their businesses, right? And so, following this, the setup and the attempt to kill Fabio, they saved Fabio. He lives. Nieto and Matisse, and actually other members of that local squad, Fabio as well, are invited to try out for BOPE. They think because they fought it, I guess because they shot it out with this gang, that some of them are worth trying out to grow or replace some of the people who want to leave this elite unit. Mm-hmm. And so there's a big part of this where they're going through the making of the elite squad, where they have to bring up that scene. It's fairly lengthy, and they put them through all this grueling kind of stuff that I thought was, okay, this got to be dramatized, because I can't see them doing some of the things that they did in any real, but maybe it's true. I don't know. But in the meantime, they're also, the other backstory is they're gathering information on Matisse in the favela, because they want to take him out eventually, right? Well, he's trying to get into BOPE. The gang is trying to gather information so that they can set him up. So those are the two things that are going on. And these cartels have long memories. They'll get you eventually if you are on their target list. Ralph, you want to speak to that? Both issues. They're going into the specialized unit, and there was part of that where if they felt you were corrupted, because they talked about you too, right? They paid extra special attention on you to bump you out, even though Fabio was targeted there. They clearly didn't want him in this elite organization. He got all the attention from the drill instructors, I guess. So you want to speak to the making of an elite unit, what you saw in the movie, and then of course this corresponding investigation of Matisse, because eventually the cartel's going to get him.
Yeah, I think that first of all, this BOPE organization has been trained by the FBI and also the Israeli police based on some information my friends provided to me. And I don't know how rigorous that what there's in the movie is actually the reality of it, but I believe that Nascimento, the Capitan, he saw ganas, from these two guys, heart desire and intelligence, and he saw Nieto as having the fire in him, and Matisse having a very good brain and stuff. So I think he saw those two as coming together as being a potential future of BOPE, where Fabio he saw as weak because he felt Fabio has already been tainted of taking money, because Fabio always talked about $3,000 a month and this and that. So he knew a lot of information about him. What was the second part of your question too? I want to make an address.
Oh, just the training of them, right? So, I'm sorry. The other part of this is the long memory, and they're investigating Matisse because they're going to eventually get him or try.
Well, I don't care. Even here in the United States, interviewing Rene Bucks Enriquez and stuff, organized crime, Mexican mafia members, they have a long memory of when you reverse your direction against them, they're going to come after you. And it's because of the monies that potentially that they lost or respect that they lost, and they're going to make an example. And they do it not only to instill a message, but also, my time working in gangs is they want to put fear in the community, and they want intimidation. I don't care if it was in Brazil, it's in New York City, Los Angeles, Mexico, El Salvador. They live by that. The gangs live by the fact that, intimidate. Look at the Avenue gang. The Avenue gang put out there that they wouldn't let certain people drive down through the avenues up in LAPD area. I mean, even some of the cops had to make sure they had extra backup. So, even Hawaiian Gardens didn't like Black and non-Latinos going through sometimes at nighttime through Hawaiian Gardens. And if you did, there was a price to pay. And, that's the philosophical approach, intimidation, putting fear of people in the community that they will not speak to the authorities.
And I think the respect part too. There was a movie, American Me, and my understanding is there was some targeting of people that worked on that movie because
someone was dead.
Yeah, presented the Mexican mafia in a bad light, and so that's in targeting Hollywood, right? I mean, so which I don't know.
If I could just say something about that, one of the rumors I heard was that what's his name, that lead actor,
Almost. James Edward Olmos.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of threats, and I'm not sure if he paid anybody off or not, but that's a lot of rumors that was said about that.
Yeah. So these guys, they go through this training, and these guys make the squad, and at the same time they're researching Matisse, and they figure out that Matisse has a soft spot for one of the kids in the favelas, related to some of the folks that are running the NGO, and he wants to help them by giving them some glasses because the kid's not studying in school. So so this guy has a soft spot. Not only does he want good quality policing, he wants to help the community. He does that. He shows that personal example, but they use that against him, right? This weakness, that's their chance to target him. But Matisse is going to do an interview, and so he can't go. And he asks his good friend Nieto to go, and of course he goes. And it's a setup. He gives the kid the glasses, and he ends up in a shootout, and he's seriously injured. And and eventually dies, right? So this goes to the long memory. This goes to the Marine being killed in Mexico. This goes to police chiefs being targeted in Mexico and other places for doing good, solid work. That's what this is about. Once they know who you are, and if you're, as I said in the beginning, either you go along and you become corrupt, or hell is coming to earth, right? It's going to be tough for you. And it was tough for Nieto because he's murdered, and Matisse because his friend is murdered while doing a favor for him. John, you want to speak to that? The realities, I know we touched about it a little bit already, the realities of being an honest cop in these situations and being targeted.
Well, Julian Lezeola, who was a
I know him.
police official, was a former Mexican military officer. He became chief of police in Ciudad Juarez, and then he also spent some time in Tijuana. He's now in a wheelchair because he was ambushed. Ambushes are not unknown against police. Mexican cartels have been known to do it, and I suspect there's strong indication they've done the same here on this side of the border as well, without getting into details of particular cases. They are predatory. When I did my field work in Tijuana, it was at the height of the Zetas being a presence trying to contest other cartels. They were described to me as being, highly predatory in targeting business, targeting government. The Zetas became the focus of the governmental action. They're now splintered. Parts of them still exist. They've been splintered. The big battle now is between Sinaloa and the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, and the CJNG has threatened police chiefs. The public safety secretary for Baja, they flew a weaponized drone into his backyard just to let him know that they had drones with grenades on them, and you need to be careful. If you go, I've heard tapes of gangsters, cartel sicarios in Tijuana getting on the police radio at night and calling out individual cops and mentioning the names of their children and their wife and where they live and telling them, hey, be careful, Ralph. You know what I mean? So it's not unheard of. They use violence as a tool. I think one of the main things that concerns political scientists when they look at this is these criminal organizations. I call the ones that use violence to this degree and have organized capability criminal armed groups, because I think they're a step beyond just a normal street gang or a drug dealing gang. They're a different animal and need to be treated as such. I think they really threaten the capacity of the state.
Well, I think what you see here after the murder of Nieto, and you see, and we saw throughout the film that BOPE was willing to use torture to get what they needed, to get information, right? And so after this officer's murder, and of course the bad guy realizes that he's part of BOPE and he goes into hiding. But this team now, including Matisse, we looked at Matisse as somebody who's honorable and honest and trying to do the right thing, but he succumbs to the methods that I think a lot of people could say are corrupt and brutal and wrong, including the torture, to get to this killer, this gang member. So his values are flexible here because of what it was. So the ends justify the means, I guess, is probably the best way to say it, Ralph. And we saw the migration of his character from a guy who was I don't want to say Pollyannish, but a little more believed a little more in the rule of law. He was actually studying law. He was going to college, but when his world became attacked by these people, his values deviated, and he was willing to do the torture. He was willing to do the things to get revenge, I guess it would be one way to say it, but to put this guy, this gangster, out of business who impacted his life. You want to speak to Matisse's transformation and the methods that they were using to find the bad guy?
Yeah, his transformation was from the beginning being a giver. And he wanted to help this young boy, 10 years old, to read because he tested him. And when his best partner, his roommate, was killed, he justified it, just like you stated, Pat, to become a committed BOPE member and to take a life. Now, to relate this to reality, I always revert back to what happened on June 24th, 2005, when Jerry Ortiz was murdered and basically assassinated. And I got to give the professionalism, the credit to the Special Enforcement Bureau, SEB, 4 houses down from when Jerry was murdered. And this is what separates us from certain other agencies and stuff. They went in and professionally apprehended Jose Luis Orozco, the murderer of Jerry Ortiz. And it's unfortunate that Matisse fell into that, but he saw the training. It goes back to the training and examples what Nascimento and the other team members of BOPE provided to him, and he saw a justification to behave in that manner, and they killed that suspect, had him on his knees, or he put the gun to his head and blew his brains out. This is what separates professionalism, from law enforcement to law enforcement as militias as in Brazil that take things in their own hand, or vigilanteism and stuff like that. And I'm proud when I see police do that. No, it hurts. Yeah, it hurt me.
Yeah.
It hurt me to see Jerry that day, and in other friends of ours we all saw. Just recently, Deputy Ryan Klinkenbrummer. I mean, up in Palmdale. It kills you in your heart, but we put our right hand up. I say this all the time when we get together, 3 of us, but that oath of office means something, and it has to mean something because the public counts on that. And so that's my 2 cents on that, Pat and John.
Hey, Martine, why don't we go and show that scene? Where is he? Which shows the torture, and then just roll that into the last scene. Bayano, I think that's how you say his name. That's the bad guy's street name.
Yep.
And we'll go ahead and finish up our show. John, same question to you. You're a young, idealistic police officer. You work really hard to get to this honorable. What you see is an honorable unit, and then you find that they're doing things that are outside of what is legally appropriate to get to their ends. So their ends justify the means for both, and they do use torture to get there. There's certainly some personal revenge to this, as Ralph talks about. You get that emotional feelings, but it's accepted there, and it's one of the reasons why the police probably still have some support from the community, because the community also suffers under these street gangs' behavior. So speak to both his transformation, Matisse's transformation, and the methods that this team uses.
I'll do this in a twofold approach. First, from the cinematic point of view, this is clearly the plot point that's been laid out through the entire film to show that society gets corrupted by corruption, to show the social environmental modification that comes with corrosive organized crime, corruption, and violence. Practically, I would say I agree with Ralph. We do a very good job in professional policing in the United States, and generally in more developed nations, although we certainly have exceptions too. Ask Frank Serpico about being targeted by fellow cops, right? But I think where this lays in a position of governance, there's a debate between the militarization of the police and using military means, and it's often looked at as being negative, and military discipline can go both ways. I would argue that a militarized police, torture, and indiscriminate use of violence and targeting civilians is prescribed. It's a violation of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. And additional Protocol 2, if you were in a law of armed conflict framework, it's a violation of human rights law. If you're in the human rights law arena, and it's a violation of penal law in every state that's there. So, but more importantly, it erodes the legitimacy of the organization with the public they serve. Yes, the public once feels victimized, and they don't mourn when a criminal gets his just desserts or his outcome, whether it's just or not. But in the long term, it breaks the trust of the community with the police and allows criminal enterprises to dominate. So I would say Yes, we ethically don't do that because it's immoral. We legally don't do it because it violates every legal regime that's there. It don't matter which one you're in. It violates all those, but it erodes our own efficiency over time, our own operational effectiveness. So there's 3 reasons why you shouldn't do it, right? But is it a reality? Does it happen? Yes, sadly it does. Humans have sometimes a tendency toward violence, and certainly seeing your friend murdered brutally impacts you one way or another. If you don't act on it, you're probably going to give you post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the hidden underlying issue we see with military and police. Suicides, for example, riddling our professions. So either way you look at it, you need to try to control against it.
Well, you see them here in this final scene. It's right up here now. They do finally catch up with the bad guy here who killed Nieto, and it was shoot first, ask questions later as they're developing informants to find out where this guy is at. And of course, they're not taking any chances on him. They're going to shoot, and it's not intended for him to survive this raid, right? This is kind of like I get the sense when they were going after Pablo Escobar in his final days as he's jumping over roofs like this guy is, amazingly, that he was not long for the world whether he threw his hands up or not. And you see them finally finish him off in the movie. And I did want to talk to you guys. First of all, thanks for recommending the show, John. This got us a chance to talk about policing in a different light than in U.S. policing. We talk about the real problems they have south of the border and all the way down in South America that most people in the U.S. would not understand, and so I do appreciate the recommendation. Maybe we'll look to do the sequel, which is Elite Squad, and I forget the subtitle of that one.
Within.
The Enemy Within, is that the? Yeah, I'll look that one up, and I'll put it in the queue. And your last thoughts, Ralph, on the movie and policing south of the border. Is there hope?
I always hope. I always have that desire that we can elevate all the different agencies throughout the Mexico, United States, South America, Central America. And last thing is that I liked the movie a lot. I thank you, John, as I stated from the beginning. It opened my eyes up some things. Also, John, what you did, it enabled me to contact my 2 friends in Brazil who provided some of their point of view. And I think it was important for me to understand from their perspective, what they see and they live with it all the time. So I thought it was great. I thought it was a great movie. John, thanks a lot. And always, John, thanks a lot for educating me here. And Pat, you too. I mean, it's great dynamic.
I think, and John, this will be my final question to you, and then we'll close off here. I hope you guys both stick around for a quick debrief. But this movie was the most popular, and so real life influenced the movie, but the movie had a real impact on the people. And I was curious as I watched it, was it because the bad guy got it in the end and the people were sympathetic to the challenges that the police have, even though they understand the corruption, but the bad guy got in the end? And why was this the most popular, given your understanding of what's going on in Brazil?
Well, I think it's good in 2 ways. One is it represents a real fear that people in Brazil face. It represents the frustration they have with the endemic violence in Brazil. Brazil has always been viewed as the next upcoming country. They have natural resources. They have highly educated portions of their population. They have economic means, and yet they always don't quite make it. So I think that's a dilemma. I mean, it's something that everybody there can sense and feel, depending upon whether you're from, the North, which is really more Afro-Caribbean, or you're from the South, which is more European. It's a big melange. I think everybody's frustrated with the state of the nation. So I think that's why it resonated. I think if you were to show it today, people would still see some of that. Now, some of that's a little exaggerated. Some of it isn't. Some of it's engineered to make points, and the points reflect reality. I think right now, in the Amazon, there's a great fear that criminal organizations are going to really extract the resources up there and cause severe environmental damage. So I think it resonated because people, one, it represents their understanding, their common plight against corruption and crime. And yes, everybody likes to see the good guys win. The question here is, who are the good guys?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for recommending the show to our audience. I want to remind you to like the show, whether you're watching us on Rumble or listening to us on Rumble or YouTube. Like the show, comment, and share it with a friend. And thank you for joining us again today. Guys, stick around for the debrief. Martine, it is all yours. Take it away.